The Great Heathen Army, Vengeance, Conquest, and Legacy. The year is 865 CE. The bitter winds of winter sweep across the North Sea as an armada of longships cuts through the churning waters. Their dragon-headed prows slice the waves like talons, bearing warriors whose names would soon be etched into the nightmares of Christian Europe. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ubbe, Bjorn Ironside, the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. This was no mere raiding party. This was the Great Heathen Army, a force assembled for vengeance, for conquest, and for glory. Origins of vengeance. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe them simply as a great heathen army, but behind this force lay a complex web of motivations. Chief among them, revenge. According to Norse sagas, King Alfred of Northumbria had captured the famed Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok and executed him by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. As he died, Ragnar is said to have uttered his famous prophecy, how the little pigs would grunt if they knew the fate of the old boar. Those little pigs, his sons, were now sailing to avenge their father's death, but vengeance alone doesn't explain the scale of what was to come. Behind the personal vendetta lay deeper strategic aims. For decades, Viking raiders had struck Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but these were primarily hit-and-run attacks. Now, for the first time, the Norse had united under a clear political vision, not just to raid, but to conquer and settle. The assembly of power. The Great Heathen Army represented something unprecedented, a coalition of warriors from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and even some who had been raiding in Francia. Estimates of its size have varied wildly over centuries, from the medieval claims of thousands to more recent scholarly assessments, suggesting between 1,000 and 3,000 warriors. While smaller than once believed, this was still a formidable force. Viking warriors were not the undisciplined berserkers of popular imagination, but battle-hardened veterans who had honed their skills across Europe. The army was led by the sons of Ragnar, each formidable in their own right. Ivar the Boneless, despite his mysterious physical condition, perhaps osteogenesis imperfecta, or simply a nickname reflecting his agility, was renowned as a brilliant tactician. Halfdan was a fierce warrior, while Ubbe carried the infamous Raven Banner, the magical standard believed to foretell victory when it fluttered and defeat when it hung limp. Yet perhaps more significant than their individual qualities was their collective leadership approach. The Great Army operated under what scholars call a distributed command structure, where authority was shared among several jarls, or chieftains, each leading their own contingent, but cooperating in council to determine strategy. Tactical innovations. What truly distinguished the Great Heathen Army from earlier Viking raids was its sophisticated military approach. Previous Norse attacks had focused on vulnerable monasteries and coastal settlements. The Great Army, however, targeted political centers and demonstrated remarkable strategic patience. Their first landing in East Anglia in 865 reveals their cunning. Rather than immediately launching raids, they established a secure base, negotiated for horses and supplies, and spent the winter building intelligence networks. This was not the behavior of mere raiders, but of conquerors playing a long game. The Vikings' battlefield tactics were equally innovative. While Anglo-Saxon armies typically fought in shield walls, tightly packed formations, where warriors overlapped shields to create a nearly impenetrable barrier, the Great Army employed more flexible approaches. They mastered the feigned retreat, appearing to break and run, only to wheel around when pursued and catch their enemies in disarray. Their formations were more fluid, allowing them to exploit openings and avoid the grinding attrition of shield wall warfare. Archaeological evidence suggests they also employed cavalry for reconnaissance and rapid flanking maneuvers, a rarity among Norse forces. Perhaps most significantly, the Great Heathen Army understood the psychological dimensions of warfare. Their surprise winter campaigns, when Anglo-Saxon kingdoms typically observed a fighting hiatus, shattered expectations. The Raven Banner, the ritual execution of captured leaders, the deliberate desecration of Christian holy sites, all were calculated to demoralize their enemies. The Conquest of Northumbria. By 866, the Great Army was ready to move against Northumbria, the first target in their campaign of vengeance. The timing was impeccable. Northumbria was divided by civil war between King Alfred and a rival claimant, Osbert. The Vikings seized York, the Roman-founded city known to the Norse as Jorvik, during a religious feast when defenses were minimal. When the Northumbrian forces finally united and counterattacked in March 867, the result was catastrophic. Both Ella and Osbert fell in battle. What followed was the infamous blood eagle ritual, a form of execution where the victim's ribs were severed from the spine and pulled apart to resemble wings, with the lungs drawn out through the wounds. While scholars debate whether this practice was historical or a later literary invention, the sagas are clear. Ivar personally inflicted this terrible death upon Ella, fulfilling his oath of vengeance for his father. With Northumbria subjugated, the Great Army installed a puppet king and turned its gaze southward. The campaign against Mercia and East Anglia, the Great Heathen Army moved with calculated precision. After securing Northumbria, they struck at Mercia, England's powerful central kingdom, in late 867. Rather than attempting a complete conquest of this formidable realm, they seized Nottingham and used it as a bargaining chip. When the Mercian king Burgund arrived with reinforcements from Wessex, the Vikings, demonstrating their pragmatic approach to warfare, negotiated a truce and winter provisions, rather than risk a potentially costly battle against superior numbers. By 869, they returned to East Anglia, where King Edmund faced them in battle. The sources suggest Edmund was offered terms, acknowledge Viking overlordship, and rule as their tributary. His refusal led to his capture and execution, shot with arrows in a manner deliberately evoking the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, another calculated insult to Christian sensibilities. With East Anglia firmly under their control, the Great Army had conquered 2 of England's 4 major kingdoms and extracted tribute from a third. Only Wessex remained independent. The struggle for Wessex. In 870, the Great Army turned its full attention to Wessex, the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom standing against the tide. Here, they encountered their most formidable opponent, King Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great. The year 871 saw an astonishing 9 major battles between the Vikings and West Saxons. The Great Army's usual tactics met with mixed results against Alfred's forces, who had learned from observing earlier Viking campaigns. At Ashdown, Alfred achieved a notable victory by adopting the Vikings' own approach to mobility and surprise. However, the relentless pressure eventually forced Alfred to negotiate, paying the Vikings to withdraw temporarily, an arrangement historians would later call Danegeld. This marked a turning point in the Great Army's campaign. Sensing that Wessex would require a protracted effort, they divided their forces. Part of the army under Halfdan returned north to secure their earlier conquests, while another contingent under Guthrum continued to pressure Wessex. The settlement and the Danelaw. By 874, significant portions of the Great Army began transitioning from conquest to settlement. In areas they controlled, they distributed land among their warriors, in a process the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes as, "They shared out the land, and they proceeded to plough and support themselves." This transition reveals a key aspect of the Great Heathen Army that's often overlooked. From the beginning, many of its warriors had come not just for plunder, but for farmland. Scandinavia's limited arable territory and inheritance practices that favored eldest sons meant many Vikings sought land abroad. The areas under Norse control became known as the Danelaw, where Viking legal and cultural practices held sway. Archaeological evidence shows they established new market towns, introduced different farming techniques, and created trade networks reaching back to Scandinavia. Their settlements were characterized by distinctive place names, ending in -by, -thorpe, and -thwaite, linguistic fossils that still mark the landscape of eastern England today. Rather than eradicating Anglo-Saxon culture, they created a hybrid society where Norse and native traditions blended. Alfred's resistance and the Treaty of Wedmore. Alfred of Wessex refused to accept Viking dominance. After being driven to the marshes of Somerset in 878, he rallied supporters and achieved a stunning victory at Edington against Guthrum's forces. Rather than annihilating his defeated enemies, Alfred employed a sophisticated political strategy. Guthrum agreed to convert to Christianity with Alfred as his godfather, creating a personal bond between the leaders. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore established boundaries between Alfred's territory and the Danelaw. This marked the effective end of the Great Heathen Army as a unified force. While Viking raids would continue for generations, the Great Coalition had fragmented into separate kingdoms and settlement communities. Legacy and historical significance. The impact of the Great Heathen Army extended far beyond its military campaigns. In less than 15 years, they had redrawn the map of England, eliminating several ancient kingdoms and establishing Norse rule over large territories. The pressure they applied accelerated the unification of Anglo-Saxon territories under Wessex, paradoxically helping create the unified English kingdom that would eventually reconquer the Danelaw under Alfred's successors. Culturally, Their influence was profound. Old Norse words enriched the English language. Sky, egg, law, husband, and thousands more terms entered everyday speech. Legal concepts like trial by jury may have been strengthened by Norse traditions. Their trading networks revitalized urban centers and connected England more closely to Scandinavian economic systems. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the complexity of the Great Heathen Army's legacy. The mass grave at Repton, likely containing Vikings who died during winter quarters, shows evidence of both fearsome warriors and family members, challenging our image of an exclusively male military force. The Great Heathen Army represented a pivotal moment in European history when Norse ambitions evolved from raiding to state building. What began as a campaign of vengeance for Ragnar Lothbrok transformed the political landscape of Britain and planted the seeds of a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture. Their story reminds us that history is rarely simple. These were not merely destructive invaders, but complex political actors with sophisticated strategies and long-term visions. They were farmers as well as fighters, settlers as well as conquerors, pragmatic negotiators as well as fearsome warriors. As we look at modern Britain with its parliamentary democracy, common law traditions, and distinctive cultural practices, we can still detect echoes of that moment in the 9th century when dragon-proud ships appeared on the horizon, carrying men who came not just to raid, but to remake a kingdom. The sons of Ragnar had fulfilled their oath of vengeance, and in doing so, they changed the course of history.